Hi everyone, in this video, I want to introduce you to something pretty cool. It's called Fragment Backstack. Now, the subject of Backstack is a process when clicking the back button in an application or activity. You may have heard of it before. So let me show you how it works here. We'll pass on over to Android Studio and we'll dispense with theory and get right down to it. Now, before we start passing backstack and fragments, I want to talk about backstack in activity. So first, let's see over a running application. So in that application, there is an activity, and that's our first activity. Here, there's a button to pass the second activity. So when I click that button, the second activity opens. So here, the second activity is open, but what happened to the first activity? Does the first activity get closed? What happens? So here, when we click on the back button, the application is closed, and that means the first activity gets closed as well, right? Because we got out of that application. So while passing from the first activity to the second activity, if you don't write closing code for the first activity, Android Studio doesn't close that activity automatically. So in other words, if you don't write closing code for the first activity when you pass to the second activity, the first activity won't close. The first activity will be added to stack. You remember stacks, right? If you go way back to your data structure lessons, you might remember the concept. It's just another way of entering data, so it can be used. So here's a good way to look at stack structure. Data gets put into a container, and then the first data that gets entered drops to the bottom, and any additions get put on top. The fun will start when you start to unload the data. The first entered data will exit last, or FILO. So now the unloading process starts with the topmost data. That's why we call it first in, last out. So this data structure concept also applies to activity. If you open activities again and again, and if you don't close them, they will be added to stack. So after you click the back button, you'll start to see activities in the queue from last to first. For example, you open up the first activity first, then you open the second activity by using the button in the first activity. And then in this case, the first activity added the lowest of the stack. And then after you pass from the second activity to the third activity, the second activity will be located over the first activity in stack. And when you click on the back button in the third activity, you will see the second activity comes from the stack. Now, if you click the back button in the second activity again, you'll see the first activity comes from the stack. So in that way, we come back from the third activity to the first activity. So if we look over our Android Studio code, in the first activity, there is a button. And over that button, there is some writing here that will say, go to second activity. If we look at Java code of that activity, I define that button first in here. Then I added a click listener to the button. And inside that click listener, I wrote the necessary code to open the second activity with the method of intent. So let's have a look at this second activity. And here is just a text view, and second activity is writing over it. So let's have a look at the second activity's Java code. And there's nothing written here. It's empty, just waiting for us, right? So let's run the application and have a look at the logic. And here we have the application opens. Second activity opens after I click the Go to Second Activity button. Now the first activity added to the stack just by opening of the second activity. So when I click on the back button, stack gets control. Because there's only one activity in stack, we'll just see the first activity. Now if I click the back button again, stack gets control and the application is closed. Because stack is empty, there is no activity to open. All right? So that's what we call backstack. Now, if we want to, we can control that backstack. So if I add a finish method after the click listener in the main activity, that activity won't be added to the stack and it will close. So let's run the application again. Application opens, click the button again. So now when I click the back button in the second activity, the application closes because the first activity didn't add to the stack. That's why the first activity didn't come back, right? But also I can override the back button and direct it as I want. In Android Studio, there's a method named onBackPress. So this is the method that controls the back button. So by using this method, I can control the process of the back button in a few different ways. So right now, let's overwrite onBackPress in the second activity. And here I will create a new intent inside the method onBackPress. First, I will make the activity open by using the intent method. In fact, when I click the back button, the first activity will not open because I closed it. But by overwriting the back button with a new intent method, I'll be able to open that first activity once again. So now let's run the application again. It's opened. I'll click the button and pass a second activity. Now the first activity gets closed by the finish method, and by clicking the back button, the first activity opens. Now, that's the basic practice and theory of backstack in activities. But does that system work in Fragments, you might wonder? And if so, how? I'll show you.